boy with one leg lives in a dump, but his kindness changes the life of rich woman. Touching story. The morning sun barely pierced the gray haze that loomed over the outskirts of St. Louis, Missouri. A forgotten patch of land, half junkyard and half wilderness, stretched beneath a sagging power line that crackled in the distance. In the farthest corner, hidden behind collapsed fences and rusting scrap metal, stood a makeshift shelter pieced together from tarp, plastic sheets, and plywood. It looked more like a pile of discarded waste than a home, but for 12-year-old Eli Turner, it was everything he had. Eli woke as he always did, slowly, with a deep breath and a moment of stillness. His leg, or rather, the place where his left leg used to be, ached in the cold. He sat up, careful not to knock over the bucket that served as his nightstand. On it lay his most prized possession, a weathered, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was stained and torn, but inside were pages of words he'd copied over the years, phrases, quotes, thoughts he'd overheard or imagined. Each one was a spark in his otherwise dim world. Outside, he stretched what limbs he had and reached for his crutch, fashioned from an old metal pipe and some duct tape. It creaked but held strong, like Eli himself. He scanned the dirt paths of the dump, familiar with the rhythm of the trucks that came in early, unloading unwanted furniture, broken electronics, bags of clothes, and recyclables. These were his treasure troves. He moved with a practiced pace, crutch under one arm, collecting cans, bottles, and anything he could trade for a few coins. The limp didn't slow him down much. In fact, most people who saw him didn't even register the missing leg first. They saw the smile. A quiet, persistent smile that felt like defiance against the misery surrounding him. Eli didn't speak much, mostly because there weren't many people to speak to, but when he did, it was always with surprising cheer. Sometimes he would say things like, "The sky's still blue, so today's a win," or "People throw away more than just stuff. Sometimes they throw away kindness too." He'd jot those lines into his notebook later, whenever he had time to sit still. Eli had been alone since he was 5. That was the year the car hit him and his mother. The woman who used to sing him lullabies was gone in an instant. He woke up weeks later in a hospital, minus one leg and plus a mountain of silence. No family came, no one claimed him. Eventually, a foster home took him in, but he ran away within months, fleeing what he called a place with locked doors but no warmth. He found refuge in the dump, not because it was safe, but because at least it didn't pretend to be anything else. Despite it all, Eli survived. He grew street smart, learned to repair broken flashlights, fix zippers, even rewire old speakers. But he never let bitterness take root. Somewhere deep inside, he believed things could still be good. Maybe not for him, but for the world in general. One afternoon, as he sorted through a pile of trash bags near a broken vending machine, he found a nearly intact stuffed rabbit. One eye was missing and its ear was half burnt, but Eli cradled it like a priceless gem. "You're still a bunny," he whispered. "You still count." He added it to the corner of his tent, where he kept his small collection, a plastic star, a chipped teacup, a key with no lock. Everything had meaning because everything had been discarded, and in Eli's world, that meant it had a story. As twilight approached, he returned to his shelter, stomach growling. Dinner was a half-eaten granola bar he'd found earlier, but he broke it in two, placing one half beside the stuffed rabbit. "We share what we got," he said. Then he opened his notebook, flipping to an empty page. With a stubby pencil, he wrote carefully, misspelling a few words. "Every day is a new chance. If today was hard, tomorrow can still be good." He stared at the sentence, reading it back aloud. Far off, the city's lights flickered on one by one. Eli watched them through a tear in the tarp, eyes wide with wonder. It looked so distant, so unreachable. Cars sped by on the highway, their drivers unaware of the boy who watched them like stars. He didn't resent them. In fact, he often imagined them having good days, laughing, listening to music, being happy. He liked believing that happiness still happened somewhere. Just before sleep, he whispered into the dark, "Maybe tomorrow I'll find something better." He didn't know that the next day, something entirely unexpected would find him instead. Claire Hamilton's days began like machinery, precise, clean, and controlled. Her morning routine was carved into her schedule like stone. Wake at 5. 20 minutes on the treadmill. Half a grapefruit, black coffee, check stock reports. Dress in tailored suits that smelled of luxury and decision-making. At exactly 7 o'clock, her black limousine would pull up in front of the Hamilton Aesthetics Tower, where she oversaw over 50 clinics across the country. Her time was currency, her calendar tighter than the stitches her clinics provided. Efficiency ruled her life, and sentiment was nothing but clutter. On this particular morning, the driver took a wrong turn. The usual route through downtown was blocked by construction, and the detour led them toward the industrial outskirts of St. Louis. Claire didn't notice at first. Her attention was consumed by an aggressive phone call with a supplier who had failed to deliver a new batch of skin-rejuvenating serums to 3 key clinics. Her voice, calm but sharp, sliced through the car's plush interior. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Disappointment, when wielded by Claire Hamilton, was more terrifying than anger. "Turn around," she snapped once the driver finally mumbled something about a landfill. The car slowed by a dirt road where piles of debris formed unnatural. Hills in the air hung with the scent of oil, metal, and abandonment. Claire pressed her manicured fingers against her temple, trying to contain the throbbing behind her eyes. She didn't belong here, in this forgotten corner of the city where lives crumbled like the rusted vehicles dumped by the roadside. She needed silence, space to think. Without waiting, she pushed the door open and stepped out, still on the call. Her heel sank slightly into the dirt, and her face twisted in disgust. But before she could take another step, her foot caught on something slick, a patch of spilled oil or damp plastic, and she stumbled. Her handbag flew from her shoulder and landed several feet away, the contents spilling out onto the gravel. Across the way, Eli had been watching. He wasn't spying, just observing, as he often did when the dump delivered unexpected visitors. People sometimes came here to toss out secrets, old wedding dresses, burnt journals, toys that once meant something. But this woman didn't look like someone who threw things away. She looked like someone who never needed to. Her clothes were unwrinkled, her posture unbroken even when startled. She didn't see Eli crouched behind an old washing machine, but he saw everything. The way she cursed under her breath, how quickly she picked up her phone again, leaving the bag behind in her rush to get back in the car. The door slammed, the limousine reversed, tires kicking up dirt. Within seconds it was gone. Eli stared at the bag. It sat in the dust like a treasure chest, its polished leather still gleaming. For a long moment he hesitated. He wasn't a thief. If anything, he hated how people assumed things about him just because he lived here. Still, he approached cautiously, checked the inside. Wallet, business cards, a slim tablet, a silk pouch with cosmetics, even a small notebook that smelled faintly of perfume. He could have walked away, sold the items to the scrapyard man who never asked questions. But Eli didn't work that way, not in his heart. Back in his tent, he looked through the business cards until he found the name. Claire Hamilton, Chief Executive Officer. He recognized the company. Ads for Hamilton Aesthetics were plastered across billboards and bus stops. Faces too smooth to be real. Slogans promising perfection. He flipped the card over. A silver address glinted under the dirt. He looked at the name, then at his crutch. He had never been downtown, never walked past glass buildings filled with people in clothes, worth more than anything he'd ever touched. But something in him stirred. Not just curiosity, but a strange pull. She hadn't even looked at him, not once. Maybe she didn't even know he existed. But he'd seen her, and for some reason that made it feel like they were connected. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay under the crackling tarp, clutching the bag close. Not because he wanted it, but because it felt like a promise. He wrote in his notebook, "Sometimes the richest people don't see the world. Maybe I can help her see it." The next morning, Eli rose before sunrise, dressed in the cleanest clothes he had, an old hoodie and faded jeans. He tied the bag carefully to his back, secured it so it wouldn't fall. Then he began the long walk, or rather hobble, toward the city. The distance was punishing. His crutch blistered his armpit. Every few blocks, he had to stop and catch his breath. People stared, some with pity, others with indifference, but no one offered help. It didn't matter. He had a mission now. Hours later, he stood in front of the massive glass tower that bore the Hamilton name. It looked like something from another planet. Security guards in suits eyed him with suspicion the moment he limped toward the front. "Tor?" One of them stepped forward, blocking his path. "Can I help you?" the man asked, already frowning. "I need to return this," Eli said, his voice calm, holding up the bag. The guard's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you get that?" "I found it. I want to give it back to Miss Claire Hamilton. She doesn't take walk-ins, especially not from—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the glance toward Eli's. Crutch and clothes said enough. Eli didn't flinch. "Then give it to her, but tell her I hope her day gets better." The guard started to respond, but before he could, another man, older with a headset and clipboard, interrupted. "Wait, let him in." The guards exchanged looks. The second man continued. "He's telling the truth. She dropped the bag yesterday." Reluctantly, they parted. Eli entered the building, his breath catching in his chest. The floor was marble, the walls mirrors, everything shining. He felt like a ghost among statues. An assistant led him to a waiting room lined with fashion magazines and expensive furniture. After several minutes, Claire appeared. She looked different than she had in the dump, colder, sharper. Her eyes locked onto the bag instantly. But when they moved to Eli, her expression hardened. "You?" she said. "Where did you find it?" He extended the bag without answering. When she took it, her fingers brushed his, and for the first time she really looked at him. "I didn't take anything," he said. "I just wanted to give it back. You left it behind." She opened the bag, inspected the contents. Everything was in place. But her hand froze on a folded paper that hadn't been there before. She opened it slowly. In shaky handwriting, written in pencil, it read, "Hope your day gets better. Smiling helps more than it seems." Claire stared at the note. Something in her expression cracked, barely noticeable, but real. She looked up at Eli, unsure what to say. For the first time in a long time, Claire Hamilton was speechless. The silence between Claire and Eli stretched long enough to make the assistant in the doorway shift uncomfortably. Claire Hamilton, known for dismantling boardroom arguments with a single look, now stood frozen in front of a boy in worn-out clothes, holding a crutch made of salvaged metal. The note trembled slightly in her fingers. For a moment, she couldn't hear the low hum of the air conditioner, the distant chatter of executives down the hall, or even the cautious footsteps of her assistant returning to her desk. There was only that sentence. "Hope your day gets better. Smiling helps more than it seems." Claire folded the note carefully and slid it back into her purse. Her expression shifted, something more guarded now, as if an invisible gate had slammed shut behind her eyes. She stepped back, clearing her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice clipped, professional again. "You may go now." Eli blinked. That was it? "I just thought it was important," he said, standing straighter. "They should lose them forever. People drop things. Doesn't mean she didn't answer." Her heels clicked against the marble as she turned to leave. But halfway to her office door, she stopped and glanced over her shoulder. "Wait here." Claire disappeared around the corner, leaving Eli alone once again. He stood awkwardly in the vast lobby, unsure if he was being escorted out or allowed to rest. The receptionist avoided his gaze. The security guards had returned to their post, but kept a discreet eye on him. Everything in the room, every plant, every artwork, every pane of glass, seemed to whisper that he didn't belong here. Claire returned moments later, holding a crisp $20 bill between two fingers. She held it out to him, not with contempt, but with a kind of forced politeness. It was a gesture she had used many times before. Tip the valet, pay the delivery. Boy, dismiss a favor with cash and distance. "Here," she said, "for your trouble." Eli stared at the money for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. Really looked. He saw the way her posture remained rigid, her jaw tense. She was uncomfortable, though she would never admit it. And that made him hesitate. "I didn't do it for money," he said quietly. Claire raised an eyebrow, her hand still extended. "I just thought it might make your day better." Her fingers closed slowly around the bill as she lowered her hand. "You live around here?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. Eli shrugged. I live where the city stops looking. She didn't know what to say to that. Something in her chest twisted sharply, but she buried the feeling. With practiced ease, "Well, thank you," she said again, more softly this time. "You've returned something important." Eli nodded, then turned toward the exit. As he limped across the marble floor, the echo of his crutch tapping against the stone followed. Him like a metronome. When the glass doors closed behind him, the lobby seemed to exhale. Claire stood frozen for a moment longer, then turned and walked briskly to her office, locking the door behind her. Once inside, she dropped the purse on her desk and sat down. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't open her laptop. Instead, she stared at the note again. The handwriting was childish, letters uneven and slanted, but the message was unsettling. Not in its content, but in how much it lingered. It was as if someone had reached inside her and touched a part of her she thought had vanished long ago. In the solitude of her office, she opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small wooden box, plain, unmarked. She opened it with care, revealing an old photograph, a 10-year-old girl with tangled hair, barefoot, standing beside a weathered woman with kind eyes. Her grandmother. Claire's throat tightened. She hadn't thought of that photo in ages. She'd buried it under contracts, luxury, and success. She had buried that girl too. She put the photo away quickly, slamming the drawer shut as if to silence the past. She straightened her blazer, composed herself, and turned her attention to the workday ahead. But the feeling lingered, like a pebble in a shoe, subtle but impossible to ignore. That evening, as she rode home in silence, the city glowed around her. Storefronts, restaurants, the never-ending rows of lights and movement. Her phone buzzed several times. She ignored it. Her reflection in the tinted window looked tired despite the flawless makeup. She touched her face lightly, then dropped her hand. The limousine passed an underpass and she caught a glimpse of a man pushing a shopping cart full of plastic bottles. Behind him trailed a child, no older than 10, barefoot in the cold. The sight hit her unexpectedly like a punch in the gut. She blinked and looked away. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the dark, not turning on the lights. The note was in her purse, and her purse was on the coffee table. "Tommy." Sentence kept coming back to her like a whisper. Smiling helps more than it seems. The words didn't come from someone who had much reason to smile. They came from someone who chose to, and that unsettled her in a way that boardroom betrayals and financial crises never had. She turned on her phone eventually, scrolling through. Emails and notifications. Nothing new, nothing urgent. But the silence felt heavier than usual. The next morning, her driver waited outside at the usual time, but Claire didn't come down for 15 minutes. When she finally entered the car, her assistant noticed the difference. Her makeup was lighter, her hair slightly undone. She didn't check her phone during the ride. She simply looked out the window, watching the city pass by as if seeing it for the first time. Eli, meanwhile, had returned to the dump. His feet ached and his arm throbbed from the long walk, but his heart felt lighter. He didn't expect anything from the encounter. He hadn't done it for reward or recognition. He had done it because it felt right. In his tent that night, he opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. "Sometimes giving something back gives you something too." Then he smiled, not because the world had changed, but because for a fleeting moment, he had touched a piece of it. Claire Hamilton had always prided herself on control, of her company, of her image, of her emotions. She'd spent decades perfecting the art of detachment. She could dismiss a board member with a phrase, negotiate six-figure deals in silence, and walk through a crowd of desperate investors without acknowledging a single one. So why did a single encounter with a one-legged boy disrupt the entire architecture of her routine? She told herself it was nothing, just a rare act of decency in a city starved for it. She tried to convince herself that Eli's return of the bag meant little, that the note was a childish gesture, maybe rehearsed, maybe even manipulative. He had looked at her with eyes too wise for his age, and that more than anything unnerved her. Children weren't supposed to see through people, especially not her, but she couldn't stop thinking about the message. At the office, she found herself distracted. During a quarterly strategy meeting, she stared out the window while her chief financial officer, outlined upcoming mergers. When asked for input, she responded curtly, then excused herself for an urgent matter that didn't exist. Her assistant noticed the shift but said nothing. Everyone at Hamilton Aesthetics knew better than to question Claire's mood. By lunchtime, she sat alone in her executive suite, picking at a salad she hadn't ordered. Her fingers hovered over her phone, tempted to look up the name, Eli Turner. She didn't even know if he had a last name. What was he doing now? Had he gone back to that place? The dump, the land of broken things and silence? She tried to suppress the guilt that whispered, "You didn't even ask him." And yet, another voice in her head argued back, "You don't know his intentions. He could have taken everything. Maybe he was testing you. Maybe he's smarter than he looks." People lie, Claire. They lie for money, for sympathy, for opportunity. That voice was her armor, the one she had built brick by brick since childhood. It reminded her that kindness could be used as a weapon, that trust, once broken, never healed clean, that people, even the smallest ones, could manipulate. Nuduntiua. That afternoon, she found herself outside the office walking without purpose. Her driver followed slowly in the car, confused by the detour. Claire waved him off and wandered into a small park nearby. She sat on a bench and stared at the children playing in the distance. None of them reminded her of Eli, but she couldn't stop picturing his face, the sincerity in it, the way he had said, "I just wanted to give it back." Claire reached into her purse and unfolded the note again. She stared at the jagged handwriting, tracing each letter with her eyes. It had been written without expectation. There was no request for money, no hidden agenda, just a boy offering something intangible, hope. The thought unsettled her more than she liked, so she did what she had always done. She rationalized. Maybe he had rehearsed it. Maybe he was working with someone. Maybe someone had told him she was rich, that she was a good target. She'd seen scams before, homeless children used as pawns, holding signs they couldn't read, rehearsing stories that weren't theirs. It was possible. Anything was possible. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Eli wasn't like that. That night, back in her penthouse overlooking the city skyline, Claire opened a bottle of wine and sat at the window. The city buzzed below, a blur of lights and movement. She was a queen in a castle of steel and glass, safe and alone. She didn't often think about her past. It had been deliberately buried, memories boxed up, names forgotten, emotions compressed, like coal. But now Eli's note had cracked something. She couldn't unfeel what it had stirred. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders and drifted off to sleep on the couch, something she hadn't done in years. Her dreams were foggy and unkind. A girl in tattered shoes running through rain, a voice calling her name, the smell of boiled beans and cigarette smoke. She awoke with a start, heart pounding, confused by the softness of her own tears. The next morning, she arrived at work earlier than usual. She buried herself in reports, firing off emails with her usual intensity. The board had requested a new plan to address labor concerns in several clinics. She drafted a sharp memo. She called her public relations team. She met with legal counsel. But by noon, the fire in her had dulled again. Her thoughts strayed. Back to the note, back to the boy. She tried to shake it off. During a brief break, she approached her assistant. "That boy from the other day," Claire said abruptly. "Did anyone get his name?" The assistant looked surprised, but quickly recovered. "No, ma'am, but we reviewed the security footage. He walked here from the industrial zone. Looks like a landfill or salvage yard." Claire nodded. "Thank you, that'll be all." She didn't explain why she asked. She didn't need to. Later that day, she found herself driving, not in her limousine, but in a rented sedan. She didn't want to be recognized, not by the press, not by anyone. She followed the route in her mind, based on the images she'd seen in the footage. The city's polished streets gave way to cracked asphalt and rusted signs. She passed buildings with boarded windows, stray dogs, trash-strewn sidewalks. Eventually, she saw the hills of the landfill. The smell reached her before the sight did. It was rancid and raw, a mixture of decay and neglect. She parked a few blocks away and walked toward it, keeping her heels low, her coat tight. She searched for 30 minutes but didn't see him. Just scattered figures, men picking through scrap, children running barefoot, the hum of desperation everywhere. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. Eyes followed her, suspicious and weary, but Eli wasn't there. She returned to her car, frustrated, and drove home in silence. That night she sat again in the dark, reading the note one more time. Her instincts screamed at her, "Let it go, Claire. Let it fade." But something in her refused, not out of pity, not out of charity, but because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen more than power, more than control. Eli had seen her sadness, and instead of turning away, he had offered a smile. And that terrified her more than anything. Claire didn't return to the landfill the next day, nor the day after. Her work resumed its usual rhythm, or at least she tried to pretend it had. She walked the corridors of her clinics with the same unwavering poise, conducted meetings with precision, and signed off on statements that would have taken her public relations team weeks to polish without her. And yet behind the facade of steel, something fragile had begun to shift. It was subtle, like hairline cracks in a mirror, barely visible, but impossible to ignore once noticed. In her office, the light changed. She stopped keeping the blinds, closed, allowing sunlight to touch the sterile walls she once insisted remain neutral. She declined a glossy interview with a fashion magazine that had been pursuing her for months. Her assistant noticed she no longer corrected the coffee order that came with cream instead of black. Small things, imperceptible to most, but the weight of them was not lost on Claire herself. One evening, after the last executive had left the building and the silence became a sort of shelter, Claire found herself seated on the floor of her walk-in closet at home. She had pulled out an old trunk, covered in a fine layer of dust, hidden beneath off-season coats and boxes of forgotten donations. The key was still taped under the lid, untouched for nearly 20 years. Inside were remnants of another life, a worn denim jacket with a missing button, a cracked cassette player that no longer worked, a child's sketchbook filled with clumsy drawings of houses and trees, and then, at the very bottom, folded into the pages of a long-expired passport, was a photograph she hadn't seen in decades. Claire stared at it for a long time. In the photo, she was barefoot, no older than 10, standing in a gravel driveway with her arms wrapped around a thin woman with thick glasses and deeply lined skin, her grandmother, Ruth. Behind them was a peeling white house with a missing front step and a yard full of empty flower pots. The girl in the photo had dirt on her knees and a wide, gap-toothed grin. Claire touched the image with the tips of her fingers. She remembered that day. Her grandmother had cooked pinto beans over a gas flame, humming an old gospel tune, while Claire had tried to teach the stray cat to sit. The air had smelled like soap and fried onions. They'd laughed when the cat stole a bite from the plate. It was one of the few days she remembered without pain. She leaned back against the wall, letting her head rest, eyes closed. The memory played in her mind like an old film reel, grainy but vivid. Her grandmother had been the one constant in a life filled with eviction notices and broken promises. When Ruth died, Claire had been sent to an aunt who drank too much and spoke too little. She had learned early to protect herself, to never ask for help, to never rely on anyone. It was survival, not ambition, that had built the woman she became. But something about Eli had peeled away a layer of that armor. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the look in his eyes, strikingly similar to the one she had seen in her own reflection as a girl. A kind of steady defiance against the world, softened only by the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, might still care. She spent the next few hours sorting through the contents of the trunk. A rusted charm bracelet, a library card signed in childish cursive, a birthday card from a neighbor who once gave her a sandwich when there was no dinner. With each item, her heart felt heavier, like every object carried a piece of the weight she had worked so hard to forget. Eventually, she placed the photo on her nightstand. It didn't match the decor, too real, too raw, but it stayed there nonetheless. The next morning, she woke up before her alarm and sat in silence, staring at the picture. She saw not only herself but also Eli in that image, The same worn clothes, the same small joys, the same invisible battles. At work, she avoided questions. She cancelled a luncheon with shareholders, opting instead to walk through one of her lower-income clinics. It had been months since her last visit. The staff were surprised. Some smiled cautiously. Others offered updates she barely registered. Her focus was elsewhere, on the waiting room, the tired mothers, the quiet children. She saw a boy leaning against his father's shoulder, swinging his legs, trying not to cry. A woman helped her daughter button a coat 2 sizes too small. Claire walked outside before anyone could stop her. That afternoon, she returned to the outskirts of the city. She wore flats instead of heels, brought a scarf instead of a handbag. This time, she came alone. The dump looked even more desolate than before. A grey fog hung low, muting the colours of the world. She wandered past rusted machinery, the hollow frames of old trailers, and piles of glass bottles that glinted like broken stars. She looked for Eli among the scattered silhouettes, but no one resembled the boy who had returned her bag. She asked a man near a smouldering barrel if he'd seen a kid with one leg. He nodded vaguely, but offered no name, no direction. She walked the perimeter for almost an hour. Her coat caught on a twisted wire fence, tearing the fabric. Her shoes picked up soot, but she didn't care. He wasn't there. Back in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel, Claire stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her lipstick had faded. Her hair was windblown, but her eyes looked younger somehow, less guarded. She returned home in the early evening and sat once again by the trunk. This time she took the sketchbook from the bottom and flipped through its pages. Most of the drawings were of small houses, trees with swing sets, smiling stick figures holding hands. But near the back was something different. A picture of a girl sitting alone on a bench looking at the stars. She closed the book and held it close to her chest. She didn't know if she would ever see Eli again. But if she did, she promised. Herself she would ask his name. Not for the sake of a reward, not for curiosity, but because it was time someone asked him. Because once, long ago, someone had asked hers when no one else did, and it had mattered. The headlines came without warning, splashed across news feeds and circulated through whispered conversations in boardrooms and break rooms alike. Claire Hamilton, the woman synonymous with success, image and perfection, was suddenly the face of controversy. Allegations surfaced, anonymous yet loud, accusing several of her clinics of abusive labor practices, unsafe environments, and falsified employee reports. Social media devoured it in real time. Influencers who once praised her services now condemned her. Overnight, her image shifted from untouchable mogul to silent villain. Claire sat in her office, the blinds drawn tight, her phone vibrating relentlessly on her desk. She didn't answer. Emails flooded in, each one laced with panic or accusation. Board members demanded urgent meetings. Legal advisors scheduled calls that began with disclaimers and ended in warnings. Her publicist drafted cold, sterile statements. She refused to sign, and through it all she felt nothing. Not anger, not fear, just an eerie kind of stillness. A silence deeper than any she had known in years. She had built everything on control. Now it was slipping through her hands like sand. At noon, she stepped out of her office without a word and descended the glass stairs that curved like a ribbon through the atrium. Her employees parted without speaking. No one asked where she was going. They didn't have to. The storm had already arrived, and they were waiting to see who would be left standing. She entered the back seat of her car, gave no direction, and watched the city blur past the window as the driver chose a route at random. Buildings turned to warehouses, warehouses turned to vacant lots. The glossy skin of downtown peeled away, revealing a version of St. Louis she had not seen since childhood, raw, cracked, and forgotten. Hours passed. The silence pressed heavier. And then, in a clearing between concrete and rust, she saw him. Eli was pushing a cart piled high with bottles, cans, and bags that clinked with each jolt. The frame of his body was thin but steady, and though the path was uneven, he maneuvered the cart with practiced ease, one arm guiding the crutch tucked beneath him. Claire tapped the window. "Stop here." She stepped out, ignoring the dust that caught on her blazer. As she approached, Eli looked up and blinked once, as if unsure whether she was real or part of the heat wave rising from the road. She stopped. A few feet from him. He didn't run, didn't speak, just waited. Claire found her voice after a pause. "It's Eli, right?" He smiled. Not a wide grin, just a flicker. "Took you long enough." His tone wasn't mocking, it was warm, like someone greeting an old friend. She couldn't explain it, but the sound melted something inside her. I'm sorry," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure for what. For being late, for doubting him, for the look in his eyes that mirrored the one she once carried. He tilted his head, thoughtful. "You okay?" "No," she admitted. "Not really." "Want to talk?" She hesitated, then nodded. They sat near an overturned bench that faced a row of discarded appliances. The cart stood beside them like a loyal dog. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was shared. "You came back," he said after a while. "I wasn't sure I would," she replied. "What changed?" Claire took a breath. The question stirred 100 answers. The noise of scandal, the memory of her grandmother, the trunk beneath her bed. But more than anything, it was the feeling that for the first time in years, she had stopped pretending. "I remembered who I was," she said simply. Eli looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Was she better than who you are now?" "She was real," Claire said. "She didn't care about being seen, just about seeing." They sat in silence again. A breeze passed, lifting the edge of Eli's hood. Claire noticed how the skin on his hands was cracked, how his fingers gripped the edge of the bench as though the earth might shift without warning. And still, he smiled. "You know," he said, "people think this place is the worst part of the world. But it's honest. Trash doesn't lie. You see exactly what people are willing to throw away." Claire nodded. "That's what I did. I threw everything away that didn't fit the image." Eli turned to her, but not the note. She blinked. No, not the note. They sat there as the sun began to sink behind the skyline. Claire's phone buzzed again. She didn't look. For once, it didn't matter. This, she realized, was not about redemption or image repair. It wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about finally seeing something she had ignored for too long. A child, a life, a chance. "Do you come here every day?" she asked. "Most days. Got to earn somehow. Bottles aren't worth much, but if you collect enough..." His voice trailed off. Claire glanced at the cart, then at his leg, the absence of it, and the strength that remained despite it. "Isn't it hard?" Eli shrugged. "So's everything. But I figure if I can get through one more day, that's something." Claire didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the cart. She placed her hand gently on the side, then turned to him. "May I push it for a while?" Eli tilted his head. "Sure, if you want." She took hold of the handle, surprised by its weight. The metal frame groaned. The wheels resisted. But she didn't let go. They walked slowly, not toward any destination, just forward. Side by side, two people from opposite worlds who had discovered that pain, when shared, becomes a little lighter. That hope, when seen through the eyes of someone who has nothing, becomes something worth remembering. Behind them, the city shimmered, in the last light of day, unaware that two lives had just begun to change, quietly, irrevocably, without fanfare or applause. Claire began returning to the outskirts more frequently, always at odd times, always alone. She no longer arrived in the black limousine. Instead, she drove herself in an old sedan she had kept in storage for emergencies, a car that drew no attention and offered no explanation. The first few visits were brief, 10, maybe 15 minutes, just enough time to bring Eli a warm sandwich, a pair of clean socks, or a thermos of soup. She never stayed long, always keeping the conversation light, always departing before the silence became too intimate. But Eli never asked her to explain herself, and that was why she came back. In a world full of questions and assumptions, he offered only presence. He greeted her each time with the same easy smile and a nod, never acting surprised by her return, never expecting anything more than what she brought. It was as though he understood something she had spent years forgetting: how to let people exist without demanding more than they could give. Their conversations grew gradually. At first it was practical talk, weather, scrap prices, the best dumpsters for finding food that hadn't spoiled. Then, little by little, Eli opened the door to stories, short ones, fragments. The time he helped an old woman carry her groceries 3 blocks because she had dropped her cane. How he once found a puppy shivering behind a broken freezer and taught it to sit using crackers. He spoke as though these things were normal, like anyone might do them if they happened to be in the right place at the right time. Claire listened, more than she spoke. Something about the way Eli told his stories made it unnecessary to fill the space with her own. But even in her silence, changes were blooming beneath the surface. She started noticing things she had ignored for years, the sound of gravel under her shoes, the way sunlight shifted across tin rooftops, the quiet dignity in small acts of resilience. On one visit, she brought him a proper thermal blanket, the kind she had seen listed in mountaineering catalogues. Eli accepted it with a quiet thank you, running his fingers over the fabric like it was silk. He didn't unwrap it immediately. Instead, he tucked it away behind a stack of containers in his shelter, as though saving it for the coldest night, not wanting to waste its warmth on a day that wasn't dire. "You don't have to keep it wrapped," she said gently. "No," he replied them, "but it's nice knowing it's there. Some things are better when you wait for that line stayed with her." That night, Claire sat by her fireplace, a cup of untouched tea in her hands, thinking about waiting, about all the things she had never waited for. Her success had been built on impatience, on never resting, never settling, never staying still, long enough to wonder if there was another way. But Eli's world moved differently. It moved slower, with less, but with more meaning. Each moment was earned, not purchased. Each comfort a victory, not an expectation. She began noticing her own habits changing. She stopped checking the stock market as soon as she woke up. She stopped answering emails past a certain hour. She read books she hadn't touched in years, books with characters who failed and tried, again who stumbled through life with hearts wide open instead of guarded. She found herself smiling more. Not the practiced, camera-ready smile she wore at galas, but the real one, the kind that sneaked up on her without warning. On her next visit, she brought a paper bag filled with small things: an apple, a roll of duct tape, a notepad, and 3 used paperbacks she'd picked from a donation bin at a local church. Eli's eyes lit up at the books. "You read?" she asked, surprised. "Not fast," he said, "but I like the words. They go places I can't." He opened one of them, running his finger along the first page like it was a doorway. Then he looked up at her. "You know what's strange? Some stories feel like they were written just to remind you you're not crazy." Claire smiled. "I think that's exactly why they exist." They spent the afternoon reading side by side, trading favorite lines. When the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the junkyard in long orange shadows, Eli pulled out his worn notebook. Claire hadn't seen it before. It was frayed and faded, held together by a rubber band. "What's that?" she asked. "My collection," he said. He handed it to her. Inside, pages were filled with sentences, some scratched, others carefully inked. Most were inspirational, some were philosophical, a few were just plain odd. But together, they painted a picture of someone who had been listening closely to the world, even when it had nothing to say to him. Claire flipped through the pages slowly. One line caught her eye. "You don't need a perfect life to live a beautiful day." "Did you write that one?" she asked. "I heard it once, might have been a preacher or a bus driver, don't remember." "It's beautiful," he shrugged. "So are lots of things people throw away." They sat in silence again. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a siren wailed, but in their small corner of the world, it was peaceful. Claire looked around. The piles of junk, the cracked earth, the old tires stacked like monuments to nothing, and saw for the first time a strange kind of beauty. Not in the place, but in the person who called it home. She looked at Eli and realized that her visits weren't about giving anymore. They were about learning, about remembering, about shedding the weight of a life built on appearances and rediscovering something far more fragile and powerful. The next morning, as she walked through one of her corporate offices, Claire stopped in front of a glass panel that overlooked the city. She watched the people move below, And instead of thinking about numbers and targets, she thought about stories, about dogs who learned to sit and notebooks full of forgotten truths. She smiled to herself, quietly, and walked away. The first photo appeared on a gossip blog with a reputation for scandal and speed over accuracy. Claire Hamilton, once the icon of high-end wellness and corporate perfection, was captured crouching beside a boy in tattered clothes, handing him what looked like a sandwich wrapped in foil. The caption read, "Claire's Street Savior, Philanthropy." Her PR stunt. Within hours, the image had spread like wildfire, igniting every platform where opinion masqueraded as fact. By the end of the day, 3 more photos surfaced. One showed her walking alongside Eli, pushing his bottle-filled cart. Another caught them sitting side by side on a broken bench in the landfill. The most damning one, at least in the eyes of the public, showed her smiling. Not the poised boardroom smile, but something gentler, warmer, human. It was the kind of expression she'd spent years shielding from cameras. Speculation exploded. Every interpretation was offered, none of them true. Some called it a rebranding campaign gone too far. Others accused her of exploiting the image of a disabled child for damage control after the recent clinic scandal. A few cynics proposed it was an audition for a political run. Everyone had an opinion. No one asked the boy's name. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Several of her corporate partners issued statements distancing themselves from her actions. 2 major investors pulled out of pending deals, citing reputational risk. Her social media pages became battlegrounds. Some posts defended her. Most didn't. They called her insincere, opportunistic, manipulative. For the first time in her career, Claire didn't respond. She turned off her phone. She cancelled meetings. She stayed inside her apartment for 3 straight days, moving between her bed and the window, watching as her empire trembled on foundations she thought unshakable. The silence she had once craved now mocked her. Her staff sent updates she didn't read. Her attorney advised statements she didn't approve. Her publicist crafted a redemption strategy that made her feel sick. On the morning of the 4th day, she pulled the photo of herself and her grandmother from her nightstand drawer and stared at it for a long time. The girl in the picture wouldn't have understood this world, this game of optics and narrative control. That girl had only known survival, kindness, and the unspoken belief that love didn't need to be visible to be real. That afternoon, Claire walked out of her building wearing jeans and a sweater. No makeup, no security, no agenda. She drove the old sedan through quiet streets, away from reporters and analysts, away from image and noise. The road to the landfill was unchanged. Dust still clung to the grass. The scent of rust and earth still hung in the air. But Eli wasn't there. She waited by the place where they usually met. The twisted bench, the stack of tires, the overturned cart, but there was no sign of him. Hours passed. The sky shifted from gold to gray. She wandered the perimeter, asked familiar faces, described his crutch, his eyes, the notebook he carried. No one could say where he'd gone. Some shrugged. One man said he hadn't seen the boy in days. A coldness gripped her. Not fear exactly, something deeper, more brittle, like guilt sharpened into panic. She returned the next day, and the day after. Still, nothing. By the end of the week, the media had moved on to fresher outrage. Another scandal, another celebrity. Claire's story was no longer the top headline, but the damage remained. Her silence had been interpreted as arrogance, her kindness as strategy. Her face still appeared in think pieces about wealth and image and authenticity, but now with question marks instead of praise. Eli's absence echoed through her every moment. She kept imagining him seeing the photos, wondering what he thought, if he believed she had betrayed him, if he thought her visits had ever been a performance, if he would ever forgive her. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to her desk and opened the drawer she hadn't touched. Since everything collapsed, the note was still there. "Hope your day gets better. Smiling helps more than it seems." She read it out loud. Her voice cracked halfway through. The next morning, she sat in her car for hours outside the old community shelter, where she had once volunteered in her early 20s, before the suits, before the spotlight. Eventually, she walked in and asked the staff if a boy named Eli Turner had come by. They shook their heads. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and sleeves covered in marker stains, offered her a cup of coffee and a chair. Claire declined the coffee, but she sat anyway. The woman said nothing more, sensing she didn't need to. Claire stared at the wall behind her, where drawings made by children covered the space like wallpaper. Bright colors, messy lines, unfiltered imagination. Among them, she noticed one in pencil, a single-legged stick figure holding a balloon. She reached for it without thinking. "That one was left weeks ago," the woman said, bored. "No name, just showed up one day on the." Claire studied it closely. The figure's smile was huge, stretching almost to its ears. The balloon said, "Tomorrow." She left the shelter quietly. The following day, she cancelled her usual meetings again and instructed her staff to stop all PR efforts on her behalf. No new statements, no interviews, no damage control. Then she sat at her desk and began writing. Not an apology, not a press release, but a letter. Simple, honest. Written not for the public, not for the company, but for a boy who had reminded her that kindness didn't always need to be loud to be real. She folded it, placed it in an envelope, and drove to the landfill. With no certainty, no guarantee he would ever see it, she tucked the letter inside a cardboard box marked "Free" beside a rusted lamppost near where they used to sit. Then she walked away, hoping, just hoping, that Eli would find it. And, maybe, just maybe, that he would believe her silence had not been betrayal but fear. That he would know her smile had not been for cameras, but for him. That he would understand her regret not as shame, but as longing. For something real, something true, something neither the world nor its headlines could ever define. The dump was quieter now. The sound of crinkling bottles, rustling wind through dented tin, and the occasional distant rumble of passing trucks filled the silence Eli had grown used to again. Claire had stopped coming. Her car hadn't appeared in days, then weeks. He hadn't heard her voice, hadn't seen her silhouette at the edge of the clearing, hadn't received even a message. She had vanished as suddenly as she arrived. And, though he had promised himself not to expect anything from anyone, the void she left behind felt real, tangible, like something was missing from the rhythm of his life. At first he thought maybe she had gotten sick, or maybe something had gone wrong at her job, but as the days passed and whispers reached even the scattered souls in the landfill, he understood. He heard them talking, about photos, about the woman from the big buildings being in trouble. Some laughed, some sneered. One man called her fake. Eli said nothing. He simply listened, sat alone by the barrel fire, and thought of her hands offering him a book. Her eyes lingering over the words he had written in his notebook. The way she had looked at the sky when she thought he wasn't watching. He never believed she had done it for show, but he also never believed she'd disappear without a word. Each morning he awoke before sunrise, stretching his aching limbs, checking on his shelter. The plastic roof had sagged in the recent rain. The edges of his belongings had grown damp. He rearranged the cartons and crates as best he could. The blanket she had given him remained untouched in a sealed bag, just as he had promised himself. The books she brought were stacked carefully in a wooden box, protected from water by a broken shower curtain. He reread them often, but his favorite moments came from reading his own notebook. The words still gave him something no one else could. Permission to hope, even if the hope hurt. Even if the person who helped him believe in it had gone silent. Then one morning, after a bitter windstorm had passed and the sun returned with icy clarity, Eli stumbled across a box marked "Free" just outside the area where scavengers usually gathered. Most of the time, these boxes contained torn clothes or expired food. He was about to pass it when something inside caught his eye. A plain white envelope with his name on it. Just Eli, written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. He froze. His heart raced as he picked it up, fingers trembling. The paper was thick, the fold was neat. He opened it slowly, half afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. Inside was a single page, pencil on paper, smudged at the edges. But unmistakably real. It was Claire's writing. She hadn't forgotten him. The letter didn't apologize. It didn't make excuses. It simply spoke. "I'm sorry I was silent. I was afraid. Not of you, but of what I saw in myself when I was with you. It was something I hadn't faced in years. You made me remember things I thought I buried, things I needed to remember. And then the world did what it does. It twisted something honest into something ugly, and I didn't know how to keep standing in that storm, so I ran. But I never stopped thinking about you. You didn't ask me for anything, but you gave me something I didn't know I needed. I wish I had told you that sooner. I hope it's not too late. I still smile. Not for the world, for me, because you showed me how. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Not yet. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his notebook. Then he sat down beside his cart, staring out across the dump. The air smelled like rust and wet leaves, and the wind scratched at his cheeks, but he didn't feel cold. Not today. That afternoon, he searched the far edges of the landfill. Behind a crumpled metal bin, he found a torn duffel bag filled with discarded medical supplies, mostly trash, cracked plastic, broken zippers. But something in the bottom stopped him. A child's prosthetic leg. It was old, worn, its strap half detached, and the joint stiff. But it wasn't broken, not completely. He pulled it out and examined it under the fading light. It was too small for an adult, too large for a toddler, somewhere in between, maybe close enough. He took it back to his tent. Hans spent hours working on it. He used strips of fabric to reinforce the strap, tape to bind the joints. He tried it on once, gritting his teeth through the pain. It didn't fit perfectly. It chafed, dug into the stump, but it held. That night, in the glow of a flickering lantern, he wrote in his notebook, "Maybe it's time to walk again, not away, just forward." In the days that followed, Eli practiced, slowly, clumsily. At first, just a few steps outside his shelter, then across the clearing, then down the path past the old barrel. The prosthetic hurt. Each step felt like a bruise blooming under his skin, but he kept going. He found a rhythm between the leg and the crutch, a dance of balance and pain and perseverance. One morning, after a particularly difficult walk, he sat on the bench where he and Claire had once shared silence. The bench leaned now, one leg snapped, but it still stood. He rested there, breathing heavily, sweat pooling at his collar. He looked out at the city skyline, far in the distance, blurred by haze. Then he whispered to no one, "I'm still here." He didn't know if Claire would come back. He didn't know if anyone else ever would. But it didn't matter as much anymore, because he had something now. Something he hadn't had since the accident, since before the system lost him, since before the world stopped asking him questions. He had direction and maybe, just maybe, a little hope. Claire found the letter again weeks after she'd written it. She had returned to her daily routines with measured caution, attending only the essential meetings, speaking rarely to the press, and remaining carefully quiet about the fallout. The noise had faded, replaced by newer dramas in the digital world, but the echo remained. Her company was no longer untouchable, her name no longer golden, but that didn't matter anymore, not in the way it used to. What mattered now was the letter, not that she had written it, but whether he had found it. Whether he had read it, whether he had believed her. She kept expecting a sign, a whisper of confirmation, a message from one of the men around the landfill, maybe a sighting, a new note tucked in the same box. But none came, and with every silent day, her doubt grew. One morning, she drove back to the outskirts, not as a businesswoman, not even as a friend, just as a woman who needed to know. The sky was low with grey clouds, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Her boots sank slightly into the muddy ground as she stepped from the car, eyes scanning the landscape. Eli wasn't at the usual place. The bench was still there, leaning more than ever, but empty. The cart was gone. The shelter, barely standing last time she saw it, had collapsed completely. She walked deeper into the clearing, heart sinking. Then, just past a cluster of barrels, she saw him. He was walking. It wasn't fast, it wasn't smooth, but he was upright, one hand on his crutch, the other balancing with a careful rhythm that looked both painful and powerful. The prosthetic was visible, old, battered, too small, but it worked. Every step was a triumph, carved out of determination. Claire stood frozen, her hand pressed lightly to her mouth. She didn't call out. She didn't want to interrupt the moment. But Eli saw her. He stopped mid-step and turned, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly in that familiar, gentle smile. "I was hoping you'd come back," he said, voice steady. Claire stepped forward slowly until they stood face to face. Her eyes searched, his looking for resentment, for guardedness, for anything that might suggest he had turned cold to her, but there was none. Only tiredness, and behind that warmth. "You got my letter," she said softly. He nodded. "It was the best thing I ever found in a box." She laughed once, quickly, but it caught in her throat. Explaining. "I'm sorry, Eli, for disappearing. For not, you don't have to," he interrupted gently. "I figured it out." She blinked, tears threatening. "You shouldn't have had to." "Maybe, but I'm used to things going quiet. This time it didn't feel like goodbye, just lost." He shifted slightly, the prosthetic wobbling under his weight. Claire reached forward instinctively, catching his arm. He didn't pull away. "You've been walking," she said. "Trying. Found the leg in a trash pile. It's not perfect, but it gets me places." "Does it hurt?" "Only when I stop moving." They sat on the bench together again, just like before, only now it leaned more, and neither of them cared. Claire looked down at his leg, examining the crude repairs and mismatched straps. "That's not going to hold forever," she said. "I know." There was a long pause. "I've been thinking," she said eventually, her voice more fragile than she expected. "I've spent my life building things that looked perfect, but nothing in those buildings ever taught me what you did." Eli didn't respond. He just waited. "You reminded me what it means to care without expecting anything. That's rare. You're rare." He looked up at her then, eyes bright but unreadable. "Why are you really here, Claire?" She took a breath. "Because I miss you, because I learned more about myself sitting here than I ever did in any office, and because I don't want this to be the end." He watched her closely. "What does that mean?" She didn't hesitate. "Want to bring you home. It means I want you to come with me, not just for a day, not just to visit." Eli stared ahead, saying nothing. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 different ways, and none of them felt adequate now. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about guilt. It was about something else, something deeper. "I want to adopt you, Eli," she said quietly. "Not out of pity, not to fix anything, but because you made me feel human again. And I want to offer you something better, something you can rely on." He didn't answer at first. His fingers tapped gently on the notebook in his lap. A crow cawed in the distance. A bottle clinked as the wind rolled it across the concrete. Finally, he turned to her, eyes full of something ancient and innocent all at once. "Only if I can still collect cans sometimes." She laughed, the sound cracking open something inside her. "You can collect the whole city if you want." They sat there for a long time, not talking, not moving, just breathing, just knowing. Later, as they stood and began the slow walk back toward the car, Claire placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Let's get you a leg that fit," she said. Eli looked at the sky, then back at her. "Let's get us both a new start." The first steps were paperwork, endless forms, background checks, evaluations. Claire submitted herself to every process without hesitation. She hired no legal team to expedite things, made no calls to pressure anyone in the system. She walked into the state office like every other potential guardian, took a number, and waited. Eli stood beside her in a slightly oversized hoodie, the new crutch she'd bought him resting under his arm. He had already undergone a medical evaluation for a proper prosthetic, and a technician had measured him for a custom fit. For now, he walked carefully but more confidently. His balance had improved, and so had the brightness in his eyes. The adoption process, however, was not as smooth. Despite her resources, Claire faced immediate resistance from social workers and legal advisors. Her name had been dragged through the media too recently, too controversially. Though she had no criminal record, the rumors alone made her a subject of caution. Her wealth raised questions, her motives were scrutinized, every interaction was noted in formal tone, every answer transcribed and filed. Claire remained composed through it all. She didn't argue, didn't lash out. She simply repeated again and again that she wasn't doing this to save Eli, he had saved himself. She was only offering him something that might last longer than winter shelter and a cardboard box. When questioned about her intentions, she simply said, "Me, when I didn't know who I was." He is the only honest thing that found. Meanwhile, Eli was placed temporarily in a residential home. It was clean, decent, managed by staff who were polite but impersonal. He didn't complain. He followed the rules, helped with chores, and kept mostly to himself. But each night he opened his notebook and read from the pages he had once written alone in the cold. He didn't write much now. Only one new line had made it in since he left the dump. Some people find gold in the dirt. Some find people. Claire visited him as often as the schedule allowed. Every visit began with protocol and ended with a silent moment where they simply sat and watched the light change through the barred windows. She brought books, he read them. She brought puzzles, he solved them. She brought stories, he listened. In one of those visits, he asked her, "What if they don't let you?" She paused, then answered, "Then I'll fight. And if I lose, I'll still be wherever you need me." Eli looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. That was enough. During the same weeks, Claire made another decision, one she hadn't planned. She began the process of converting one of her unused properties on the edge of the city into a shelter, not a facility, not a project with a logo, a real home. She called it Eli's Place. No fanfare, no investors, no press release. Just a soft launch with city approval and a promise to keep the doors open every night of the year. She donated half of her personal wealth to fund its operations indefinitely. The first residents were children, teenagers mostly, displaced by systems and parents who had failed them. She visited weekly, not as a figurehead but as a listener. She read bedtime stories. She cleaned floors. She taught one of the girls how to tie her shoes properly. Word spread slowly, quietly, that something real was happening inside those walls, and all the while she waited for the judge's decision. It came in the spring. Claire sat in the courtroom with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm. Eli was there too, his hair trimmed, his clothes new but simple. The courtroom was almost empty, save for a few court officials and a guardian representative. The judge, a tall man with lined skin and tired eyes, read through the final documents in silence. When he finally looked up, he studied Claire first, then Eli. "This case has been unusual," he said, hot. "Not because of any legal errors, but because of its." Claire said nothing. She didn't move. The judge continued, "The boy in question has survived what no child should have to, and the woman requesting custody has endured a different kind of scrutiny, equally harsh. But what speaks loudest today is not wealth, nor reputation. It is the consistency of care, the honesty of intention, and the willingness to show up." He signed the document. "The court approves the adoption." Eli didn't smile right away. Instead, he looked at Claire. When she looked back, he finally allowed himself a grin. Not wide, but real. She reached for his hand and held it tightly. They didn't celebrate with a party. No photographers waited outside. They went home. Home now, meaning the house Claire had prepared for them just outside the city. It wasn't a mansion. She had sold the penthouse weeks earlier. This house had a garden, 2 bedrooms, a fireplace that crackled with real wood, and walls that didn't echo when you spoke softly. On the first night, Eli placed his notebook on the shelf above his bed. The thermal blanket she had given him long ago was folded neatly at the foot. On his desk sat the prosthetic he no longer used, kept now as a reminder, not a tool. Claire stood in his doorway before turning in for the night. "Are you okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, but can I still go back to the dump sometimes?" She blinked, then smiled. "You can go wherever you want. I just want to remember," he said, "what it was like and who I became." She stepped forward, kissed the top of his head and whispered, "Come back. Just promise me you'll always—" "I will," he said. "This is home now." They turned out the lights, and for the first time in a long time, both slept through the night, safe, warm, and without anything to prove to the world outside. The sun rose over the modest house on the edge of the city, casting soft light through curtains Claire had chosen herself. Simple, white, nothing showy. The quiet was different here. Not the silence of absence, but the kind that came from peace. Birds outside, the hum of a distant lawnmower, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon oil Claire used on the furniture every Saturday. Eli's room was alive in a way no space he had ever known had been, not because of decoration or gadgets, but because everything inside it had been chosen with him in mind. His books were stacked. On low shelves he could reach easily. A small desk held his notebook, now more filled than ever. Above the bed, Claire had framed one of his favorite lines: "Kindness doesn't always change the world, but it always changes someone." School had started 2 weeks after the adoption was finalized. Eli walked in on his first day using his new prosthetic, properly fitted and custom-made. A sleek design with reinforced joints and padding that didn't bruise. He had chosen the color himself, navy blue with a silver stripe. The clinic had offered plain options, but Claire had insisted he deserved to choose something that felt like him. At school, he was quiet. He didn't talk much the first week, but the teachers noticed something unusual. He listened more closely than most kids his age. He paid attention. He smiled, though not often. When asked to write about something that made him happy, he wrote, "Having a clean place to sleep and someone who waits for me to come home." Claire picked him up every afternoon. Sometimes they stopped for ice cream, sometimes they walked through the park near the school. She never pried about his day, but she always asked. And when he wanted to talk, she listened with the same care she once reserved for board meetings and mergers. The shelter Claire had opened, Eli's Place, grew slowly but meaningfully. More children began arriving, brought by social workers who had heard whispers of a place that didn't judge, didn't lecture, just welcomed. The walls were painted in soft colors. The furniture was second-hand but comfortable. Every child was given their own locker, their own bedding, and their own space. No questions on the first day. Just a warm meal, clean clothes, and a toothbrush. With their name written on it in marker, Eli began visiting on weekends. At first he just watched. Then he helped with chores. Eventually he started talking to the younger kids. He told them about the dump, about the stars you could see when there were no roofs, about finding a rabbit toy missing an eye and deciding it was still worth keeping. The children listened like he was telling fairy tales. One Saturday afternoon, Claire found him sitting in the reading corner with 2 children on either side, all 3 flipping through the same picture book. She didn't interrupt. She just watched from the doorway, something soft and painful swelling in her chest. He didn't need saving. He had never needed saving. He had needed someone to see him, to recognize the value already inside him. The shelter received pushback, of course. There were always critics. Some said Claire was trying to clean her image. Others said she was interfering in a space she didn't understand. But those who walked through the doors of Eli's Place felt something different. It wasn't just a project. It was a home disguised as a building. A place built not from money, but from memory. Eli kept writing. He filled notebook after notebook. Claire started reading them with his permission. She noticed his style changing, his sentences growing longer, more layered. He began writing stories instead of fragments, always rooted in truth, but edged with hope. One evening, while they were cooking dinner together, pasta, the only thing they both agreed was easy enough to trust, Eli turned to her suddenly. "I want to tell more kids what happened to me." Claire paused, spoon mid-stir. "You mean your story?" He nodded. "Not to get attention, just so they know they're not alone." She thought for a moment. "How would you want to do that?" "I don't know, maybe just talk. Maybe write it down someday." She reached over, touched his shoulder. "When you're ready, I'll help." He smiled. "I think I'm getting ready." The next morning he brought a few pages to breakfast, typed, single-spaced, a title on the top, "The Boy Who Found Gold in the Trash." Claire read silently as he ate cereal beside her, pretending not to watch her reaction. By the third paragraph, she had to stop and wipe her eyes. "This is your voice," she said softly. "Don't ever let anyone take it from you." He nodded. "I won't." Life settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Not perfect but consistent. Eli still had nightmares sometimes. Claire still found herself doubting if she was doing enough. But every time they sat together, whether over books or pancakes or silence, the distance between their pasts and their present felt smaller. Claire no longer wore her suits. She no longer feared her name in headlines. She had turned down an invitation to return to the board of directors for her old company. Instead, she spent her days managing the shelter, helping Eli with schoolwork, planting vegetables in the backyard. Her hands had blisters now, her nails chipped, but when she smiled, it wasn't forced. It was something earned. Eli began volunteering at the library near their home. He read to children during story hour, sometimes choosing his own writing. The librarian asked him once if he wanted to train as a youth assistant. He said, maybe. But first, he wanted to finish writing one more thing. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Home is not made of bricks, it's made of someone who waits for you, someone who stays." And just beneath that, in smaller letters, "and maybe a dog too." Claire laughed when she read it. "We can talk about the dog," she said. "Next week?" he asked. "Next week," she promised. Years passed with the quiet grace of a well-loved song, each season familiar, each day bearing the gentle mark of continuity. Eli Turner, once the boy of the landfill, became something else in the eyes of the world. He was no longer the nameless face behind a newspaper scandal, nor the quiet figure trailing a cart down an alley. He was now a young man, confident, compassionate, and fully himself. And his story, the one he once feared no one would care about, became the very foundation of something that outlived the shame and silence he had once carried. Claire watched him grow from the passenger seat of life, never steering his course, only helping pave the road when he needed it. She remained a constant presence, not just as a guardian, but as a partner in a mission they never officially declared, to make forgotten children feel seen again. By the time Eli turned 18, he had published his first book. Not a memoir, but a collection of stories, some real, some fiction, all drawn from the truth of his life and the lives he'd encountered at the edge of society. Voices in the Quiet was modestly released through an independent press. It didn't top charts, it didn't go viral, but it reached the people who needed it. Social workers passed it from desk to desk. Teachers read excerpts aloud in classrooms. A public librarian in Chicago sent Eli a handwritten letter that simply read, "Your book is the reason 3 of my students now want to write." Claire cried when she read that. Eli didn't stop there. He began speaking at youth centers, shelters, juvenile facilities, anywhere that would have him. His voice was soft but certain. He didn't sell inspiration. He told the truth. He talked about hunger, about pain, about being invisible. But more than that, he talked about kindness. Not the kind that came with headlines or tax receipts, but the quiet kind. The kind that looked like someone showing up, staying, asking your name, listening when there was nothing to say. At 20, Eli opened a center of his own, just blocks away from where he had once slept beside a pile of discarded televisions. He called it the Smile Room. The name confused donors, intrigued volunteers, and delighted the kids. Inside were books, notebooks, shelves of snacks, and walls covered in murals painted by local artists. Every inch of the place whispered, "You belong here." Claire was there on opening day, standing beside him as he cut the ribbon with hands that no longer trembled. She didn't speak during the ceremony. She didn't need to. Her pride was evident in the way she looked at him, as if the world itself were finally catching up to the truth she had seen long ago. On the main wall of the Smile Room hung a framed page from one of Eli's earliest notebooks. A single sentence written in pencil, the letters uneven but firm. Kindness doesn't change the whole world at once, but it changes someone's world, and That's enough. Underneath, a plaque bore his name, not as a founder, just Eli Turner, once a boy who remembered to smile. Over the years, Claire and Eli returned occasionally to the landfill. It had changed, cleaned up in some areas, more overgrown in others. One time they found the old bench still standing, leaning even more than before. Eli sat on it while Claire stood nearby, her coat flapping in the wind. "You ever think about how it all started here?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Every day." He reached into his coat and pulled out a notebook, still the same kind, spiral-bound, worn at the edges. He flipped to a page, scribbled something new, then closed it. Claire smiled. "Another quote?" "Maybe. Can I read it?" "Not yet." They stayed there for a while, not needing to say more. The sky was low and silver. The city behind them buzzed with noise and ambition. But here, among rusted fences and stubborn wildflowers, there was peace. As time passed, Eli's name became known in small circles, not as a celebrity, but as a helper. His center expanded. New locations were opened with the help of grants, and donations he never asked for, but always accepted with gratitude. He trained volunteers, mentored teenagers, helped dozens of kids write their own books filled with poetry and dreams. Claire stepped back from public life entirely. She took joy in gardening, in quiet breakfasts, in rereading Eli's first letters. She never returned to her company, never chased headlines again. Her legacy was no longer built on skincare empires or sleek marketing. It lived in the laughter of children in sunlit rooms, in the stories passed from one hand to another, in the steady rhythm of a life redefined. One evening, at a small event, marking the 5th anniversary of the Smile Room, Eli took the stage. No microphone, just a circle of chairs, warm light, and about 50 people who had come to hear him speak. He didn't prepare a speech, he rarely did. Instead, he told a story. He talked about a boy with one leg who lived in a tent behind a garbage heap. A boy who thought the world had forgotten him until one day, someone dropped something, a bag, a name, a piece of her world, and didn't expect him to give it back. But he did. Not for reward, but because he believed things deserved to be returned, not thrown away. He looked at Claire across the room. "That moment," he said, "wasn't when my life changed. It was when it started." There was a long silence after he finished. No applause, just stillness. Some wiped their eyes, others sat perfectly still. Claire smiled, not with pride, but with deep, resonant peace. Later that night, Eli found her on the rooftop, gazing at the stars. "They look the same," he said, "they always do. But I don't." She turned to him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He looked back at the city lights. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "That's the point, isn't it?" "For not turning away." Claire thought for a moment. Then she answered, to see myself. "Thank you for seeing me before I knew how." He placed his hand over hers, quiet again. And so they stayed there, under the sky they both used to watch alone, now watching together, changed not by power or wealth or fame, but by the simple, relentless grace of kindness remembered.